Welcome to the Beyond Atheism podcast, with me, Nathan Alexander, and my co-host, Todd Tavares. Moving beyond questions of God's existence, this podcast asks, what's next in a world without God? If you're enjoying the show so far, make sure to like and subscribe, rate and review, and consider supporting us on Patreon.
Despite the fact that now over half of British people are non-religious, Britain is still far from being a secular state, with an established Church of England, a monarch who is the defender of the faith, and seats allotted in the House of Lords for bishops, and even publicly funded faith schools able to discriminate based on religion. To discuss the paradoxical state of secularism in Britain, we are joined by Emma Park, the new editor of the Freethinker magazine. Emma, welcome to Beyond Atheism.
Hi, both of you. Hi, Todd and Nathan. Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Super glad to have you here.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. Looking forward to talking with you. Can you just to start, just tell us about your own background? What was your own religious background like, and how did you get into secular activism, and how did you come to be the editor of the Freethinker?
It's quite a long story. I went to a religious school, especially between the ages of 13 and 18, a very sort of Church of England school. We got a lot of preaching, a lot of hymn singing. And I think by the time I was about 15 or 16, I just sort of had reflected on it quite a lot and just decided that it wasn't for me. I was quite into physics at the time in particular, and just sort of thinking about the universe and what we didn't know about science. It just felt as though the idea that there might be an anthropomorphic God seemed extremely, extremely Earth-centered, given that, we're one tiny planet in among billions and billions.
Mm.
So it started from there, really. Then at uni, I studied classics and did a PhD, and one of the two authors I focused on for my PhD was Lucretius, the Roman poet of the 1st century BC. And he has this whole poem from a sort of almost non-religious point of view, which is quite amazing, 2,000 years ago, where he sort of sets out this view of the world based on Epicurean philosophy, that everything is made up of atoms and void, and the gods, if they do exist, are just sort of made of superfine atoms and float around in empty space. But I was just really interested to see how this poem, which was even considered somewhat radical in its time, was suppressed really a lot for centuries by the Catholic Church. And it was sort of rediscovered after centuries of more or less suppression in the 15th century, as Stephen Greenblatt has written about in The Swerve, which I think is a really good introduction to that sort of huge impact, I think, which on the nature of the universe, Lucretius' poem had on the culture of the time, and just the idea that there might be a way of you can actually explain everything without having to resort to a divine explanation, the idea of a sort of a sentient, conscious will that somehow directs everything. He almost reminds me in a way of a sort of Richard Dawkins avant la lettre, because he's quite a militant, almost atheist, a sort of scientist, militant atheist in a way, just as Dawkins was later, and with some of the failings, I think, that Dawkins also has of maybe being too simplistic in his views about religion. Right. But yeah, I mean, from there onwards, I was always interested in that side of things, secularism, humanism, did various other bits and bobs, did some classics teaching and lecturing, did a bit of law, then realised that a legal career was not for me. So then I decided, eventually when I had my daughter a few years ago, I decided that now was the time to get into writing, which I'd always wanted to do. And I also happened to do podcasting for the National Secular Society because I sort of got involved with them. And then there was lockdown, and that was a very good time to do podcasting, because it was a good way of communicating with people.
Yes, yeah. We know that from our experience.
It's that happens.
Yeah. One of you've got to take advantages where you can find them.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that I started podcasting in September 2019, and I'm still doing a bit of that for the National Secular Society. And I think that talking to such a huge range of people on issues which I didn't necessarily know much about before has really made me aware of actually how religion in Britain is more entrenched than normal people who don't know anything about it, but are sort of, if you're a sort of average, not very religious person in Britain, you might think, well, religion is just, it's just a few bishops in the House of Lords and that's about it. But
Right,
actually,
right.
it's much more entrenched in our institutions and in our society and in sort of government and local authorities and general attitudes than you might have thought. So I think it's definitely something that needs to be drawn attention to a bit more.
Well, but before we get into that, can you tell us more about the Freethinker itself? Because you've just taken over as the editor. Can you tell us more about the publication, what its mission has been historically, and what the focus will be going forward?
Yeah. So the Freethinker is quite a distinctive publication. It was founded in 1881 by George William Foote, who was part of the 19th century secularist movement and had been and later would be a close associate of Charles Bradlaugh, who was the president of the National Secular Society at the time and spearheaded the secularist movement. I think it's important to be aware that secularism in Britain in the 19th century was a bit different from, well, there are so many different concepts of secularism,
Yeah.
but secularism
Yeah.
in 19th century Britain was an incredibly radical movement. They were on the radical end of the liberals. They were very reformist. They were very much working class, but they were also individualist. And I think their main thrust was we want to get rid of religious privilege. We want to get rid of privilege in general. We want to abolish the monarchy. So it was always Republican, but religion is one of the really biggest problems in our society. And in 1880, Charles Bradlaugh had tried to enter Parliament, but had basically he had been elected, but he had been not allowed to take his seat because, first of all, he said he didn't want to swear an oath on the Bible to God to say that he would undertake his duties and so forth. Then they said he couldn't affirm. Then he said, okay, well, the oath doesn't mean anything to me, so I'll just swear it anyway. Then they said he can't do that. So he was elected several times more. But it took him till 1886 before he was actually able to take his seat. So it's quite remarkable that just for being known to be an atheist, he wasn't allowed to take his seat in Parliament for effectively 6 years. But I think it was partly not just because he was an atheist. There were other atheists who were known to be atheists. It was because he was so open about his atheism in criticising religion publicly, and also because he was working class and there was a lot of class snobbery. So George William Foote had previously had a bit of a dispute about with Charles Bradlaugh because he was a very he was a very authoritarian figure in his own way, ironically. He wanted to be the leader and he didn't brook any opposition. But when Bradlaugh got refused entry to Parliament, this sort of pushed Foote back into sort of supporting him and made Foote himself, I think, more radical and more outspoken in his views. So Foote decided to found the Freethinker as a magazine to sort of promote atheism quite aggressively. And in fact, if I just look at what he said, he said that the purpose of the Freethinker was to wage relentless war against superstition in general and against Christian superstition in particular. So that was the purpose of the Freethinker at the beginning. And he hoped to push the limits of free speech by publishing blasphemous things, blasphemous cartoons, blasphemous articles. Right. And yeah, so poor Foote, 2 years after he had founded the Freethinker, he was actually imprisoned for a whole year for publishing blasphemous articles. In particular, a cartoon entitled "Moses Getting a Back View," in which portrays Moses looking at the trousers seat of the trousers of God coming out through a cloud, and based on some quote in Exodus which allegedly says, "Thou shalt see my back parts," and this was considered extremely blasphemous and obscene, right, and generally offensive and outrageous in every way. So yeah, 12 months of hard labor is what Foote got, and for quite a lot of that time he was actually in solitary. He hardly had and he wasn't allowed much reading material at all. For the first month, I think he was only allowed the scriptures. So he was, right, right, in a really he had to really suffer for his free speech. But after that, he came back and he carried on publishing blasphemous things, and he was never prosecuted again. So that's the foundations of the Freethinker. It's always been radical, or it's long been radical. It's long been extremely anti-religious, and quite very sort of, from the perspective of what then would have been called the ordinary working man. I think it's changed over the years. I think one problem that secularists faced, even in the late 19th century, was that society was becoming secularized. And because of that, religion was actually becoming less of the key issue. Socialism was taking over as like the really big working class movement. And Bradlaugh and the secularists who remained secularists were, many of them, especially Bradlaugh himself, and I think probably Foote as well, were not socialists because they were very much individualists. And for me, actually, free thought and the traditions of the freethinker are very much individualist. Rather than thinking about the good of the collective, they think about the good of the individual and how the individual, may achieve life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness effectively. So they've always been rather a minority organization.
Yeah. So Emma, you make it sounds like it comes from a more radical liberal perspective.
Yes.
Is that
That's
what
how it has been.
Is that where you're going to keep the focus?
I think we have to. I think I'm going to have to change it a bit because I think in the 21st century we have to really think, where do we stand, and what is the sort of focus of secularism and free thought today, and in the sort of spirit of the 19th century, but dealing with the problems that need to be faced. And I think today what is actually important in general is the individual against all the many collective things which are trying to sort of, I don't know, delete the individual or just make the individual almost like a statistic or a point of data collection for the tech companies or whatever. I think so. The motto that we're going to have from now on is going to be liberty, reason, humanity, with very much a focus on the rule of law, democracy, civil liberties in general, but in particular freedom of expression. And I think that the idea of freedom of expression is absolutely crucial to the flourishing of a democratic society. Freedom of expression about everything, about really challenging all preconceived opinions. And I mean, the Freethinker was about being anti-superstition. And today I think we still have superstitions, we still have a lot of dogma and dogmatic ways of thinking, but they're different dogmas and they're different dogmatic and narrow-minded ways of thinking. For me, what I want is to foster a culture where people can talk freely and where they can challenge received views about any topic. And so, whatever dogmas, whether they're religious dogmas, cultural dogmas, scientific dogmas, technological dogmas, corporate dogmas, all of that needs to be challenged. We have to have a culture where it is okay to talk.
What is it still going to be? You used the words anti-religious earlier. It's still, would you put it that strongly, or is it irreligious?
I think non-religious is what I would go for. So the way I would really define it is as a magazine about free speech and open inquiry from a non-religious perspective, whether you're atheist, secularist, humanist, skeptic, free thinker, however you define yourself, really just starting from the perspective that, we don't know what created the universe, if anything did, but there doesn't seem to be any reason to suppose there's an anthropomorphic God. So let's start from there. It's more about the approach, not about, a particular set of doctrines. It's precisely about how can we approach things in an open-minded way. So culturally, we have this sort of idea of liberalism, of the freedom of the individual. But politically, the freethinker has always been non-aligned, even though it's tried to sort of advocate for reform. But I think in the secularist, atheist, humanist traditions, there have been a lot, a very broad spectrum of political views. So we're not going to take a political line. We're going, and I mean, I'm going to hopefully have contributors who will disagree with each other, and that's great. I want readers and contributors to be able to challenge each other's views. So yeah, and I think again that's important. I don't want to think that readers come to the Freethinker just to read stuff they agree with necessarily.
Right. Yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, I feel like that's such a big problem with so much media today is that, I mean, if you have a left-wing magazine or right-wing magazine or whatever, I mean, it's just articles that the audience is just going to nod along with. Yeah. I mean, I guess we want to get later on to more about sort of the challenges for secularism in Britain, but maybe we can just talk a little bit more about this issue about like individuals versus the collective, and maybe you can say more about like where do you see these threats coming from, I guess, towards like free expression and so on.
I think there are numerous threats to free expression. I think free expression is the weapon of the individual. And it's not only the weapon of the individual, but it is an essential part of the ability of the individual to determine their own existence and to live life the way they want to, because free speech, free expression, and free thought are two sides of the same coin. You cannot think freely unless you can express yourself freely. And unless you can think freely, you cannot be a full individual with the ability to live life the way you want to. So that for me is what is crucial. And I think there are endless pressures on us in the modern world to think like other people. I mean, we can say advertising, that's a huge thing, which is pressurizing us to think the way other people want us to think. Any social media company is going to sort of nudge you in a certain direction. Religion, of course, any dogmatic religion, of course, there are undogmatic approaches to religion, fine. But any established institution is going to have its dogmas it wants to impose on people. Political authorities of the left or right, they're going to want to impose their dogmas. Even, in the pandemic, we've seen the authorities or, I don't know, the health companies, anything like that, people who have an interest in pushing a certain view on others and want to do it by authority rather than by encouraging people to, or treating people as rational beings who can understand different points of view. And I think you've got to tolerate different points of view. And if you start not tolerating different points of view, then that makes me worried, because that makes me think, someone has an agenda. They want only one view to be available. And, if you look at Mills on Liberty, for example, which, Nathan, I know you wrote about, I think one of the things that's absolutely crucial for him is that you have got to allow all sorts of diverse opinions to be aired, because you never know, you can never be sure that the prevailing opinion, the prevailing morality, the prevailing standards of what is decent and what is obscene is right, because one generation might completely disagree with the previous generation, but you can't make progress unless you have the possibility of different points of view.
That's a lot to take in. Yeah. No. All right. Doesn't match up with where our questions had us
Yeah,
going
no, I
necessarily.
mean, I feel like, I don't know, maybe we can just spend a little bit longer on this topic and then move on to the secularism angle. I guess there's sort of a danger of of being for sort of free speech and free inquiry and so on. I mean, obviously, I agree sort of in general with those causes, but then also, I mean, I guess there could be a danger of just like going against received wisdom just for the sake of it, like just sort of being a contrarian for its own sake, and then I don't know, like you wind up with like vaccine skepticism or something like that, or whatever. I mean, do you feel like that's a danger?
I mean, I guess there's always a danger in free speech, because the danger in free speech is you get views which are misleading. At the greatest extreme, you get the incitement to violence.
Right, right.
On the other hand, with vaccines, that's great if they definitely know that they work, but you have to persuade the people to be able to, that they can trust them. And in order to do that, you have to have every view aired, and you have to make sure that the scientists actually demonstrate that they have done sufficient tests, and that they are to be trusted. They have done them for a sufficient length of time. You have to demonstrate that the scientists who are reviewing the tests, for example, in the coronavirus pandemic, I think this is a very, very relevant point, that they are not just in the pockets of big pharma. That what is their skin in the game? Do they have vested interests in the background? I think that if we're talking from the perspective of individual liberty, you have to treat all people as able to understand arguments, even if they don't understand all the science. And therefore, you have to allow all views to be aired, and you have to persuade people. Now, I know this is quite an idealistic view. And, if you go back to someone like Plato, who is the other person I sort of studied quite a lot at university, he had the opposite view, which is that, most people are too stupid to understand. And then, if we look at the 20th century, we see all the terrible things that speech did. Look at the Weimar Republic. Look at Hitler. Look at the way that you can use speech to incite racial hatred and that sort of thing. So, of course, speech has dangers, and we need, to some extent, rules for how it operates. But I think what we really need to do is actually come to an understanding of how to do that as a society. We need to have a shared culture for how speech might work. But I think we do have to trust people to a large extent. I think maybe the limits of the law should be something like, inciting violence. That's bad. Harassment. That's bad. That sort of thing. Libel, slander. But within that, I think you have to have a fairly wide range, because you never know who is going to be in charge, who is going to define what counts, say, as abusive speech, what counts as hate speech, because it's the people in charge, the people with power, who will make those decisions. And the more power you give them to make those decisions, the more they will be able to stop speech that they personally don't like. So I think it's very difficult once you start having a lot of restrictions on free speech, not have it sort of bound up with who happens to be in power at the time. So I think it's much better to sort of come to a communal consensus about it, but to allow all sorts of different points of view to be shared. And the other thing is that, of course, it's really bad when speech incites violence, but at the same time, if you don't allow views to be aired, I think they get worse often because they fester away. I think there's been a lot of resentment in Britain over the last 20 years among some people that they feel like political correctness or wokeness or whatever have stopped them from speaking out. Now, that may or may not be true, but I think that if it's not allowed in the mainstream media, if it's not allowed in public discourse, then they just go and say it on Twitter or they go and say it in their private accounts or whatever. And it gets worse, it gets more extreme, it pushes people away. So I think you have to have a way of trusting people and letting them speak together. Somehow, I don't know how exactly, but I think
Yeah.
one can only
Yeah,
keep
yeah.
trying, really.
Right. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it from the sound of it, it seems like you're trying to build the Freethinker into that sort of cultural spot where you can have that mixing of ideas, where we can experiment with how far we can stretch freedom of speech and freedom of expression, and how we can learn where these limits ought to be if we feel there are. Is
Yes,
that
I
part
think
of
so.
the aim?
In a positive way, though, not just being nasty or horrible or abusive or inciting violence, but um, using argument, using logic, bringing clarity to the discussion, but not being afraid to make arguments which might be censored for some reason.
Hmm. Are there any issues that you won't touch?
Um, Possibly, I'll have to think about it. I don't want to
Okay.
limit myself, but the
Right.
very
Yeah.
most sensitive issue of all is race, and I would be very loath to do anything about that unless I knew exactly what I was getting into, because it is such a very, very sensitive topic. Um, I think that transgender identity is another one that is a really, really difficult topic to do successfully, although I think that is important to approach.
Definitely. What if we go the other way? Are there any sort of sacred cows you want to see turned into hamburger, or are there topics that you would love to really just, or
Um,
not in a destructive, violent way, but just see something really taken apart and explored?
I think
That's been.
there are many, many sacred cows, but I think that everything where there is a dogma, whether it be religion, whether it be even transgender identity or protests, whether it be COVID or how we should approach that, and whether lockdowns are a good idea, for example. Those are all big sacred cows. There are all sorts of other ones. What counts as offensive? How much should we be allowed to insult people? But I think that really just starting with the question of who has the power, who doesn't have the power. How can we challenge the sort of the things that we're told? Also, I mean, I think for me, rather than just attacking sacred cows gratuitously, I want to think about the law. How does the law work? How do our philosophical ideas work? But also just try and foster a community of people who are interested in entertaining different opinions, thinking with an open mind. So I'm quite interested in doing profiles of free thinkers from all sides of the political spectrum. Also looking at the history of the free thinker and the history of secularism, looking at philosophy and its relationship to religion. So not necessarily, not gratuitously cultivating controversy, but just trying to clarify people's ideas without always feeling worried that whatever we say might get censored or
Yeah. Yeah, I think,
self-censoring.
yeah. Right. Yeah, I mean, I think there's sort of a legal issue about, what sort of speech is allowed, but then I think there's also like a cultural thing about encouraging a kind of culture which does permit yeah, just like even to just sort of like give sort of tentative opinions on certain cases without worrying about like, am I going to get canceled for saying this or whatever.
But you also have
Yeah.
stronger libel laws there, don't you, for the press?
Yes, libel and slander. Yeah, you have to be careful what you say about individuals. That's definitely very true. And but the thing is, I don't think there's any. I think that it's very wrong to try and slander or attack individuals. I just don't. I think that's a very uncivilized form of behavior. And it's very easy to attack people because they've said the wrong thing. And I think the right thing to do is to challenge ideas rather than people. And that's a much more humane approach, because I really think, part of individualism is actually respecting all people for themselves and not merely pigeonholing them in some sort of stereotype. Yeah, so I think that aspect is important. So I hope that we won't have to worry too much about slander or libel issues.
Yeah,
Touch
right,
wood,
right.
apart from just every other thing.
Right, yeah. Yeah, maybe we can sort of transition into talking about sort of the state of secularism in Britain. We wanted to sort of list some things like what we talked about at the start, like for example, like having the Church of England as sort of the established church, and to just if Emma, if you could rate from 1 to 10 the possibility of these things, say in our lifetime, being abolished, for example. So say disestablishing the Church of England, for example, like say from 1 being the least likely to 10 to the most, what would you say for that to happen in our lifetime?
Oh gosh, giving percentages. Adding
This is like a highly
Yeah.
scientific.
quasi-scientific, yeah.
Yes.
The problem with disestablishing the Church of England, I was talking actually to an Anglican about this the other day, and he said, well, I think quite a lot of Anglicans would be quite happy to disestablish the Church of England, because, we feel that religion is a private matter, which is what secularism is all about anyway. The problem with it is that it is incredibly legally, enmeshed in British law and British society, British life. And the legal complexities of disestablishing it would be an absolute nightmare. Within my lifetime, so what, I guess, being sort of optimistic, the next 50 to 60 years, I'm going to be hopeful-ish and say 6 out of 10.
Okay. All right. Okay.
But yeah, I mean, I think it would depend on having a strong liberal government with some competent individuals with a good, a really good legal ability, who could sort of work out all the technical details, and the political will. I think a lot of the electorate just don't care, which is why it hasn't been high on people's agenda, on any of the political parties' agenda. I think. I'm not sure that any political party is in favour. Possibly the Lib Dems might be, but yeah. I think it's definitely a long-term thing.
Yeah. So as an American, I'm still fascinated by the existence of the monarchy. And coming from as the editor now of a Republican magazine, is that still going to be a platform? Is that one of the planks
Oh yeah, definitely.
abolish the monarchy?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Always been a good part of secularism, definitely.
Where would you put the odds on that one? Is that something that there's any popular taste for abolishing it? I guess you just said it's part of a secular issue. Is it still a realistic goal that people are attempting to achieve?
Well, I think that if the monarchy is abolished, then the church will be can be disestablished at the same time. Yeah. So it'd be rather neat to kill two birds with one stone.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. But, don't be too literal about that. That sounded like an incitement of violence.
Oh yeah, I might be committing treason inadvertently. Yeah. But I think that I wouldn't have said so maybe 10 years ago. But the Queen is about 96 now. She's been incredibly popular, and she's managed to keep being popular despite weathering all sorts of scandals, both with her children, and even some of her grandchildren. And the monarchy has had its ups and downs over the years, but at the moment, her son Andrew is obviously in complete disgrace. Harry and Meghan have left the country. I think that Prince Charles, if he becomes king, will not be able to live. He won't live for that long. He'll be pretty old when he ascends the throne. My sense is that he, I may be wrong, but my sense is that he's not going to be very popular. He's got rather an unfortunate antecedents, because, of course, Charles I was beheaded, along with his Archbishop Laud, who was beheaded a few years before the king. So that's not good. That's a bit ominous.
Right.
But Yeah, I mean, William and Kate might be a bit more popular. I think generally they haven't done anything wrong, so that's a good start. But there was actually a very interesting article by Polly Toynbee in the Guardian. She's a big sort of very eminent Labour commentator, and she made argued for the abolition of the monarchy after the Queen goes, and the fact that she's doing that in the Guardian might suggest that the mood is shifting. I think that it won't be short term, but who knows what might happen? You never know. If we have the right combination of circumstances, could happen in my lifetime. I'll give it maybe 5 out of 10.
5.
Again,
Okay.
being optimistic.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. What about removing bishops from the House of Lords? Well, maybe you can also just explain like what that's all about.
Yeah, what on earth is this bizarre?
Yes.
Both parts are shocking.
Yeah.
Our constitution in this country is very, very strange. I mean, it seems pretty liberal and forward thinking in the 19th century, but unfortunately, it hasn't really changed since the 19th century, and I think that's part of the problem. So we have a head of state who is a hereditary head of state, which is bizarre, and because she's hereditary, she can't really do anything. She has little power. She might in sort of situations of crisis, but generally she doesn't have much power. So the power is really all the prime ministers, because if the prime minister has a majority, he can basically, or she, do basically whatever he or she wants. Because the House of Lords, ultimately, if Parliament really, if the House of Commons really wants an act to go through, it will go through, and the House of Lords cannot use its veto, permanently. I think they get 2 shots at rejecting the act, and then if they reject it the third time, it still will be pushed through. So they have limited power. The House of Lords is itself an extremely problematic chamber. And I think one point made by many people about the bishops is that getting rid of them would work best as part of a wholesale House of Lords reform in this sense. So at the moment, we have 26 bishops from the Church of England who are entitled to sit in the House of Lords. Have 5 bishops from and archbishops who sit there by virtue of their seat, Winchester, Durham, York, London, Canterbury, I think it is. And then we have the rest, the other 21, sort of take turns, I think, on a basis of their expertise or interest. They don't always sit there all the time. I think they rotate unless there's a matter on which they are particularly interested. For example, I think they strongly opposed the reform to assisted dying, the assisted dying bill, which was proposed last year and which has now sort of fallen dead in the water, which is a shame. So if they have a religious issue, which they have strong feelings about, then it means that, more progressive, more liberal law on a secular basis is often sort of thrown out. It depends on, again, if you have a Conservative government, because the Conservatives have traditionally been sort of more Church of England because it sort of reinforces their sort of hierarchical system. If you have a Conservative government sympathetic to the Church of England, then again, that makes it less likely that any laws that the C of E opposes will go through. I think they were generally opposed to gay marriage, for example. So we have that problem. On the other hand, people always say, well, why get rid of the bishops? They may be a bit funny about some issues, but actually they're quite moral. And there's even this sort of this strange feeling that which the Church of England and other religious organizations propagate, which is, if you don't have religion, how can you really have any sort of morality? I think that's actually a problem that secularists, humanists, atheists do face and do have to challenge, which is that, you can actually have some sort of ethical standards even if you're not religious. And I think personally that the key is humanity. You have to think about other people, and see them as ends, not as means. But because of this funny situation where the bishops might vote in their interests but are generally seen as moral, people don't necessarily want to get rid of them, because the way the House of Lords works is it's normally by appointment of the Prime Minister through some sort of honour because they've done something. So you might have political appointment, you might have someone who's, a football player or a businessman or something like that. So you get all sorts of types sort of appointed by one prime minister or another, and then they just stay there. So the numbers are swollen. So the current number of peers in the House of Lords at the moment is 768, which
Oh
is
wow!
insane.
All right.
That is
Yes. Wow.
way too many, right? That's more than
Yes.
the number of MPs.
Is it
Right.
still
Yeah.
hereditary?
There are a few. I think in the region of 90 peers or something like that, possibly slightly fewer. But the House of Commons is 650 members, right? So we've got over 100 more peers than
Yeah.
MPs.
Right.
So it's a very, very strange top-heavy system. It's very obscure. Prime ministers can create a whole bunch of new peers if they want to pass a law and they need more support in the House of Lords. So it's really,
Right.
again, under the control of the prime minister. Possibly, almost you might say that in some ways the bishops are some of the when it's not an issue that affects them personally, they can be quite good. They can be quite objective because they not necessarily politically aligned in other respects. So in our peculiar system, there is actually quite a reasonable, not totally convincing, but reasonable argument for saying that well, we might as well have the bishops. We've got so many other random people in the House of Lords.
Yeah.
So I think really, in a way, it needs to the change needs to go with full scale reform. Can you reform the House of Lords without having a wholesale constitutional reform? Possibly. I think that a lot of people, ever since Brexit in 2016, ever since the Brexit vote, a lot of people have been really strongly calling for a lot of constitutional reform, because in the last 6 years we've seen so many unsatisfactory aspects of our political system. We've seen Boris Johnson in 2019 prorogue Parliament. We've seen judges called the enemies of the people. It seems as though the system of constitutional conventions and an unwritten constitution which we've had has been tested to its limits, and it seems like it's time to maybe make the rules a bit clearer. So I think that there is an appetite for constitutional reform. The question is, will we ever get it? And the other thing is, do we keep our strange electoral system of first past the post, which
Right.
means
Yeah.
that
Right.
you very often get party in government with quite a landslide of seats, but they still only, because of the peculiar mathematics, represent about 30% of the electorate in terms of the party that they voted for. So there are all sorts of issues. Are they going to happen? When are they going to happen? Will any party bring them in? Because for Labour and the Tories and the Conservative Party, for both of them, the system benefits them in the end because it's always got to be either Labour or the Conservatives, one way or the other. So they're the two main parties. Are they ever actually going to change from the first past the post system? Because they know that, one day, even if they have to wait for a bit, they'll get in power again, probably. So I think there are all sorts of issues there. It's a bit of a creaking old system. I think it's definitely time for change. Bishops, in a way, are only a small part of that.
Yeah. Well, then maybe we should change the scope a little bit and think about this as Britain has gone through this increasing secularism, where now it appears that a majority of Britons are not religious. How has that changed what people sort of focus on and what they want and what they see as a good moral outcome? So let me give you an American example. The old atheist sort of focus was things like prayer in schools and in God we trust on the money. And when you talk to religious people about atheists, they think like, oh, that's that angry person who doesn't want to open the town meeting with a prayer. But when you talk to atheists these days, what you find is that it's really focused on, sexual freedoms, reproductive rights, and environmentalism. Has the change in England sort of followed that as well, where the focus for people who are not religious, it's not really about bishops in the House of Lords, and it's not really about the old woman with the fancy hat in the big house. It's become either these sort of day-to-day issues or different existential crises like the environment. Do you see a change in what the secular population focuses on in British society?
I think it's very difficult to talk about the secular population because, we're talking about over half the country of, 65-ish million people. I think a lot of people just don't care. Religion's not part of their lives. They just get on with their normal lives and they just don't think about it. It doesn't really affect them much. So I think we're looking at it, people may be atheists, but that's it, whatever. I think that there was a very sort of strong active atheist movement with the new atheists like Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and stuff in the 2000s. And that coincided with the most secular, most liberal period, I think, for Britain. Ironically, because Tony Blair was obviously a very strong Catholic, but nonetheless, his spin doctor, Alistair Campbell, famously said, "We don't do God." Because Britain was so secular, he could say that. But I think actually, although people are increasingly less religious, the discourse in the media and in politics has become more religious in the last 10 years because it has gone with this sort of tightening of attitudes, this distrust of free speech, which has really taken root, especially since 2016, when it was considered that, we voted, 52 to 48 to leave the EU because of a lot of misinformation. So people have really got sort of been worried about free speech. And with that, I think it's been easier for religious groups and for all sorts of other reasons, which we can go into later, to have more influence. I think in terms of what secularists want, what atheists want, what humanists want, that depends on who you talk to. I think the two main organisations, really the two national organisations in Britain, are the Humanists UK, and the National Secular Society. Now, I may be biased because I've been working for the National Secular Society. I'm not a member of Humanists UK. I am of the National Secular Society. The reason why I chose the one rather than the other was because I actually, as a freethinker, don't really want to sort of belong to a group on the basis of its philosophy. But I think that the National Secular Society performs quite a useful political role. For me, secularism is about politics, whereas free thought is about philosophical views. Humanists UK is a bit different because they want to advocate for a philosophical position, which is also political. So they include secularism in their mandate. And they're sort of very much on the progressive end. I don't want to speak too much for them, but they seem to be, they're interested in all sorts of ethical issues. I believe they're interested in environmental issues. They're interested in a lot of the same stuff as the National Secular Society: education, constitutional reform, that sort of thing. But they also have a wider remit. And they are interested in things like humanist weddings, humanist funerals. So that's sort of advocating a specific philosophy with representatives on the basis of that philosophy. Secularism, as it is today, as represented by the National Secular Society, obviously different people have slightly different views, but I would say it is fundamentally about the view that religion is perfectly acceptable if you want to be religious, but religion is a private matter. And the secular public life, the state, public institutions, education, all of that sort of thing, is not a matter for religion to have any influence over because of its being religious. Now, you may, of course, have people who are religious, who are involved in politics, who are involved in education, who are involved in healthcare, but they should not get any special privileges on the basis of being religious. So I think that's where we are in Britain. It's slightly different, I think, from in the US. Things like climate change. I mean, I think anyone who is secular and who has a non-religious view would say, look at the science. And the science is fairly clear. I think that, the climate change is happening. So I think people would obviously be concerned about that as human beings. But I think that is only a secularist issue to the extent that it might be something which religious groups are using their political influence to campaign against. So I think as far as the National Secular Society goes, which again is a different remit from the Freethinker, their concerns are with specific issues where religion is having too much influence on politics, and their sort of aim is to campaign for an end to religious privilege. So such things as bishops in the House of Lords, such things as this very, very strange situation we have where in England and Wales, which has a slightly different system from Scotland and Northern Ireland, a third of state schools, of publicly funded schools, are faith schools in some way or other. They have some sort of religion in their constitution. They have religious influence from local religious leaders. And that is actually quite incredible, really, in a developed Western society, that you should have so much religious influence over state-funded, taxpayer-funded education. Especially since I think, it's often the case, but we can, talk about this more. I think a lot of parents are quite unhappy with the current situation, but I think education is really a big deal. Also, other issues like assisted dying is quite big. Anything which comes up, a recent example of an issue which has just come up is that during COVID, they changed the law to allow women to have abortions privately at home by taking pills, which could be sent to them. Before you had to, I believe you had to have a sort of the first one after you'd had a consultation with the doctor, and you had to take the first one in the surgery under supervision. They changed that in a way that was much better for women's reproductive rights. But now they're saying they're going to end this sometime later this year, which is a step backwards, a regressive step. So, that's an interest of concern to the National Secular Society. Is there religious influence behind this? We know that the Prime Minister has just converted to Catholicism. We know that, the Conservative Party is fairly close to the Church of England. What's going on here? So it's that sort of thing. But education is a fundamental concern, I think.
Yeah, that's always a big one. Could you tell us a little bit more about? I'm not sure what that exactly looks like. What sort of powers to either discriminate, or what sort of indoctrination are they able to offer using public money? Are there any
I
limits?
should say it depends. It very much depends on the school. It depends on the particular branch of the particular church which is involved. Of the a third of state-funded schools which have a sort of religious constitution in some way, the great majority are Church of England, and then the next biggest is the Catholic Church, and then there are a few for minority religious and cultural groups. I think there's just not very many, one or two Hindu schools, and then there's some Muslim schools and some Jewish schools. But the great majority is Church of England or Catholic. The problem is, as far as the Church of England and Catholic ones go, that they are entitled to select a certain number of children on the basis of their religious belief, if they're oversubscribed, as they normally are, because we've got a huge problem with education that, schools are very often oversubscribed. So that means that they can sort of push parents to get their children confirmed or get them more into religion just in order to get them into the school. Once they're in the school, there is still this very, very strange provision that faith schools are allowed to teach religious education and, bizarrely, relationships and sex education according to the tenets of their own faith. Which means that, in a Catholic school, you're not allowed to say that, being gay is illegal, but you can sort of say that the Catholic Church doesn't really like it. And that sort of thing. And you can focus on Catholicism. You don't have to teach about other religions very much. And, you can say that we view a marriage as between a man and a woman, that sort of thing.
Right. There can be
So I think,
moral indoctrination.
yeah, there is a big risk that might happen. And for example, in Northern Ireland, where the situation is worse because they've got far fewer non-religious schools, and it's very much contributing to segregation between Protestants and Catholics. There's a recent case which has gone through the court recently, and we're waiting for judgment on it. I understand from the lawyer who was doing the case that judgment is hopefully expected in the next month or two. There were these sort of non-religious parents who sent their child to I'm not sure I can't remember whether it's Protestant or Catholic, but they sent their child to a Christian faith school, and she started praying late into the night, and the father was absolutely horrified. And you say, why is my daughter doing this? I didn't ask her to. She's sort of starting to get into the habits of doing what the school is telling her to do. So I think it's just a feeling of perhaps partly parents not having the ability to sort of bring their children up in their own traditions, but against that, not only that, it's more about the children having the choice and the ability to make their own decision and having the information to make their own decision and not being segregated according to religion. I think that's a problem, particularly for minority faith schools. It's a very difficult topic because you might think, well, why can't Muslim or Jewish parents bring their children up? And this is part of the parents' right to bring their children up in their own religion. I think two things. First of all, I'm completely in favour of anyone who wants to found, within limits, to found a school that's a private school, in according to religion or whatever. But when the taxpayers funding it, I think that there have to be a lot more common standards. And one of the difficulties that we've been seeing with minority religious schools is that often they end up really dividing children much more than they should be, according to very specific cultures. So they really get isolated from other cultures, and I think that's really problematic if we're trying to have a society where people really respect and tolerate each other. So I think that's the problem with in particular the minority religious schools, and then indoctrination is a bit of a problem for all faith schools, and it's just a big problem that citizens of the country continue to fund this system indirectly through taxes, even though we're a secularized society where over half the people aren't religious, and it's very much in the interests of society for everyone to appreciate each other, to grow up with people with different points of view from different cultures.
And with that in mind, I think we should move on to the lightning round. Nathan, can you explain how can a true atheist blah 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 works for Emma?
Yeah, we've got a lightning round called "Can a True Atheist," and it's just sort of asking questions whether a true atheist can do such and such. Like, can a true atheist say, "Oh my God," for example? And Emma, I don't know, like, do you identify? Would you identify as an atheist, or
We can change
I'd
it to
say,
freethinker.
yeah, yeah?
yeah, freethinker stroke strong agnostic.
Okay, all right,
Okay.
okay. Okay, let's say freethinker. I guess maybe that's would a freethinker do or can a freethinker do such and such? Okay,
It's
so
not a trap, Emma.
yeah,
We
yeah.
promise.
Well, yeah,
Okay.
it's just tongue in cheek for the most part.
There's no wrong
Um,
answer. Feel free to
no,
elaborate as much as you need.
yeah, yeah. Okay, so can a true freethinker believe in God?
That I think it is difficult. I think it is
Uh-huh.
difficult. It depends. You know what? I'm going to come back and say, how do you define God?
Ooh,
Oh,
as a metaphysical being, supernatural, all-powerful being that created the universe, and it really
Right.
exists, not like a fictional character.
Yeah. Well, that's difficult because I mean, are Buddhists atheists? Do they believe in God? I mean, how abstract can God be before it doesn't count as
yeah.
being God?
Uh,
I think that.
I think she's
you're
played this game
you're
before.
you're pushing the questions back on us. Yeah,
Well,
I mean, I think
however
that.
you choose to define God, Emma.
yeah.
How about that?
Well, okay. Well, let's sort of maybe take an Aristotelian approach as a sort of prime mover. Was there something that was the prime mover of the universe? Was there a cause before all causes, before which there was no other cause? And the answer is, I don't know. Can you
Right.
believe in one as a free thinker?
Uh-huh.
I don't think you can positively believe in one as a free thinker, because I think that I think you would have to say we don't know, because that's going right back to the Big Bang. And as far as I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that scientists sort of reckon they know up to what the first 3 billionths of a second or something like that. But before that, we don't know. So I think, yeah, I think that we can't. I think you can't have a positive belief in something if you're a free thinker about which there is no evidence, because as a free thinker you try to use logic and reason. If you're thinking about the most likely explanation, maybe some people have a view who are free thinkers as to what the most likely explanation is for what came before the first 3 billionths of a second. So perhaps if you did have a strong view about that, you could have a view that the most likely explanation was the prime mover, the first mover. Yeah, I can't see how that could be, but maybe you could.
I'm going to write down your answer as no.
Okay, fine. Yeah, take it as no. In short, yeah.
Okay, here's one. Can a true freethinker support monarchy?
Yes, I think a true freethinker probably can, because a true freethinker is not politically aligned. And I think that politics is very different from philosophy. Free thought, like humanism, probably is a philosophical position, which looks to sort of universals, or looks to the relationships between people on a personal level. For me, at least, I don't know. Politics seems like a pretty much a pragmatic, rather dirty game, in a way that always depends on the best of the options available, which may be a choice of two lesser evils. So I think it'd be perfectly plausible to say, well, maybe the monarchy is just the lesser of two evils, or the lesser of how
Right.
many evils at the moment.
Right. Okay. Can a true free thinker support teaching religion in schools?
Yes, definitely. And in
Ah,
fact,
okay.
it would depend how you teach religion in schools, but
All right. Yeah.
yeah, and
Yeah.
not indoctrination, no.
Right. Okay. Right.
But
Right.
religion is a huge part of human culture,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
in all cultures across the world. And I think that if you ignore it, then you ignore a very fundamental part of our story, of all of our stories, historically. So I think it would be wrong to not teach it. It's just a question of how and which subject it is taught in.
Okay. Can a true free thinker be spiritual?
Now, you see, you're asking me these really difficult questions, but you haven't told me what spiritual means either, have you?
Believe in connections to the supernatural.
I think it's difficult for. I think probably I would have to. If you want me to have a yes or no answer, I'd have to say no, because supernatural is something which, again, I think a free thinker, has to sort of say, well, what's the most likely explanation, and is it likely that there's anything supernatural? Probably not, on balance. On the other hand, there are more things in heaven and earth ratio. I think there are lots of things which today are science, which before would have been seen as magic. I mean, think about the internet or wireless communication. That feels like magic in a way. I'm sure that if the Romans came here, they'd think we're all. It would be an incredibly magical society. So it's it's a question of what is supernatural. Maybe it's just the things we don't know about yet. But I think that you can't positively believe in something spiritual. At most, you have to sort of take it. But you can't think that it's supernatural. But you might
Right.
think
Right.
that more things are there than that we know about.
Mm-hmm, right. Okay. Can a true free thinker be an anti-capitalist activist?
Yeah, again, why not?
Okay.
Because religion is
Right.
different.
That's easy.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I sorry, I don't want to sound flippant, but
No. No.
it's again, politics and philosophy are different, and in fact, many free thinkers, have a wide variety of views. For example, Mariam Namazi, who I was just interviewing for the Freethinker, she's a communist. Fine, why not? You might think that that is the best way of setting up society, but she would say that I believe that she is not against free speech. She's very much in favor. But I think a free thinker has to support certain principles, certain approaches, certain methods, such as free speech, logic, clarity, humanity, that sort of thing. But I don't think that they have to support or oppose a particular political structure necessarily.
Well, then, can a true free thinker believe that there are limits to free speech?
I think absolutely. I mean, I think that it's very important that there must be some limits to free speech, and I think that the question for our times is, what are those limits? The internet really took off in about 2000 when I was 16, and I think that's had an absolutely huge impact on free speech, and I'm especially in the last 6 years, and then even more in the last 2 years, because now free speech is strangely enough in many ways not about speech; it's about words typed into a computer. And once you start having that, I think that we've really got to think a lot more about what does this involve. Can we censor people by searching for words they use? I mean, how are we going to control all this enormous amount of speech that's come out because people are frustrated and so they're typing things into social media? But if we look at Hitler or whatever, if we look at communism in the Soviet Union, and we look at the way China is hugely censoring free speech, there are bad things with free censorship, but there are also bad things with free speech in the wrong way. So yeah, absolutely, it's crucial to find out what those limits are, but the only way you can do that is by speaking freely to some extent. So it's a sort of paradox. But yeah, I think there are some limits, but what they are is difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sort of related to that, and for the last question, can a true free thinker vandalize a church? Would that count as sort of legitimate speech?
Wow. You know, for me, one of the just sorry to approach this from a slightly indirect route, but again, I think a lot of the problem with many of these debates is they are general and they don't look at the particulars. And I think really anyone who is trying to solve all these difficult issues, you've got to look at the specifics. So I would ask, why are they vandalizing a church? What church? What did the church do wrong? I think vandalizing is a really difficult one. I'm generally not in favor of vandalizing because it just seems like an act of violence, which seems quite unnecessary in general. But, one could imagine extreme cases, perhaps. in which a church had done something, I don't know, gone out and massacred a bunch of people of a different religion, when you might think, okay, fine, well, they vandalized a church, doesn't really matter. Or they needed to do it to make a point, to exercise their free speech. But I think it would have to be in quite an extreme case, I would say. But it does depend on the particular circumstances, and I think it's difficult to make generalizations about something like that.
Wow. This has been a lot to take in, Emma. I've learned a lot about Britain. I've learned a lot about the politics there and how not very secular it is. As a part of wrapping up, can you tell us how to find the Freethinker, and or if people want to contribute to it, how they can get in contact with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's going to be online from the 5th, Saturday, the 5th of March, at freethinker.co.uk. There's a contact form there, for submissions. Please just read my brief submission guidelines. Basically, really interested in people who know what they're talking about, able to write with intelligence and clarity. I don't mind what your political position is. I just want a good argument which will help people to sort of understand something a bit better. Or you can email editor@freethinker.co.uk.
Well, thanks again, Emma. This is a lot of fun.
Great. Well, thank you, Nathan and Todd, very much. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Okay, that was Emma Park from the Freethinker magazine.
Yeah, it's going to be a hit. That's going to be
Yeah. Yes. What were some of your takeaways from that?
Well, I mean, I had no idea there was so many vestiges of religion still lingering and hanging around in the UK. That was weird.
Hmm. Hmm.
That very
Hmm.
sensible, like, it doesn't really matter approach. Sounds very British, doesn't it?
Oh, you mean like with regard to things like the bishops in the House of Lords and
Yeah,
so on? It's like,
and the Queen.
yeah,
Yeah. Oh, that old thing. Pay no
yeah,
mind to that. Just a
yeah. I
wave.
mean, it's somewhat similar in Canada. I think like with regard to the monarchy, and we also have an equivalent of the House of Lords called the Senate, which is also just appointed. I mean, we don't have bishops or anything like that, but it's just like the prime minister appoints the senators, and it's like it's not totally democratic, but there's not too much. It doesn't seem like there's too much political will to fundamentally change this. And I mean, I guess there's always that sort of like conservative, like small c conservative impulse, like unless something is like a serious problem, I mean, it's best just to not worry about it too much. I don't know. I mean, like there are so many problems with the House of Lords, I guess, like she was saying, that like the bishops seems like a kind of a small part of it, for example. I
Right.
mean,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And
Mm,
I didn't know free thought. I didn't know it as a like philosophically liberal
mm,
position or project, I guess we could say. Because this sounds like it's very much about free speech now. Which
yeah.
you're a free speech absolutist, right? That's where you stand.
No, I don't think so.
No.
I'm not an absolutist, no. I mean, I don't know what like if I have an easy way to explain my position, but I mean, I feel like in general one should err on the side of free speech as much as possible, I guess. I mean, obviously there are plenty of limits I would put up. Yeah, what about you? Are you I don't know what the
I
opposite of
I I think free speech
Mhm.
is a very good ideal. I think it's aspirational, right?
Right,
But I
right.
don't think it exists now. I don't think it's ever existed. It just
Hmm.
doesn't. It's sort of like this. Yeah, it's an aspiration. It's the thing that we want, and we all want it, and we all think it's ideal, but none of us have any way of actually approaching it.
Yeah. I guess there's two ways whether it's to think about it. I guess like there's sort of from the legal perspective, like can you be thrown in prison or fined or whatever for certain speech, or what, or from a more like social perspective, like is there a culture that encourages speaking your mind? And I guess like I think probably there are some cases where like the first option is perhaps exists in some places, but I mean like the second one is much more difficult to achieve. I think the sort of the social norms around free speech.
But even legally, like any sort of power dynamic, right? Like
Yeah.
no one has free speech at work. It's legally Legally, that's recognized. You don't
Oh,
have to
that's,
finish your work, right?
yeah, no, that's true.
Right. Your bosses can literally tell you what to say. And
Yes,
among
that's
that, there
true.
are plenty of things that you cannot say. So
Yeah,
that if
that's,
we're talking about having this project where we shouldn't have any limits to speech, you're immediately omitting where you spend most of your waking life, right? At work.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And to say that the university is become part of that certainly has. I mean, it strives to teach people to speak freely. It strives to give that liberal perspective on how we talk about these things, using Locke and Mill to talk about the harm principle, to talk about what the practical limits ought to be. But it's also a place where, like, every economics program is going to teach you about the market, and the market is the best way to solve any problem, right?
yeah,
Like,
mm-hmm,
that's like, you're not going to get a job in the economics department as a hetero-orthodox
right.
professor. You
Yeah,
can't write papers on autarky or nationalizing mines. Like, so that, like, that it immediately closes off ideas, and we know that.
yeah. I mean, I feel like in practice, I mean, maybe we should have asked this, but like sometimes I feel like people advocating for free speech often line up with conservative positions. I mean, like small c conservative. I mean, in terms of, I don't know, like it just sort of happens that
No, yeah,
you
no,
don't think so.
it's whoever feels most aggrieved at the moment.
Yeah, that's a
And
good.
that's
Well, I mean,
that's really what conservatives didn't make a big deal about that when they're cracking down on anti-war activists, when they're out,
yeah,
like,
that's true.
I've been in positions where I've literally seen police attack people for protesting the idea of free trade, right?
Right, right.
And you don't have this legion of right wingers talking about, hey, we need free speech. They have the
Oh
right to
yeah,
be there,
no, no,
right?
yeah, yeah.
But when it goes the other way, like, they don't want to get a vaccine, it's, oh
Mm-hmm.
my God, how dare you affect my freedom of speech?
Yeah, yeah. It's always, yeah, like free speech for me, but not for thee or whatever.
That's
Yeah.
right. And even cases where it's not actually a free speech issue, right? When you're just like, you're Googling nonsense and you think that you're being slighted by some algorithm. Right?
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yeah, that's right, right. Yeah,
right. Like,
yeah.
that's not a violation of your free speech.
It is a difficult balance. I mean, like an issue about say like well, say like vaccines or something. I mean, it's difficult because you might say like, well, we should get a pro-vaccine and anti-vaccine person to like debate it, but then it sort of gives the impression of there being kind of two equally valid sides to this issue. Yeah, I mean, not to say that like Emma's doing that or anything like that, but I mean, I guess that's always a danger or whatever.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's always a danger because it's not like turning into the both sides issue. And a lot of it is also manners. Like, it's rude to, there are words that are rude to use, right? I can
yeah,
immediately think of a ton of them,
yes,
right?
yeah,
And, like,
yeah.
the context totally matters, right? It's different around your parents than with your friends,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
We
Mm-hmm.
get that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a big hornet's nest. Um, the idea that she puts forth with the magazine, though, is really empowering, right? Like, well, how do we build a culture that fosters this sort of either cross-cultural or debate without malice manner? I mean, that's important. It's definitely something that we need, and this ability to at least to try it, bounded by guidelines of harm and malice, and inciting violence, right? That's always the big one.
Right. Yeah, I think the challenge is like trying to, I mean, not just become sort of a platform for like kind of these heterodox views without sort of people engaging with them on the other side, and I guess like finding people to contribute without I guess without like sort of like like cranks and so on like
Yeah,
and
yeah, edge
are
lords, right?
are really happy to like you know
Trolls.
uh yeah, exactly, right. So I mean they would definitely be happy to like contribute their views or whatever, but then like who wants to be in a magazine or whatever with them? I mean that's kind of
Yeah,
the challenge
yeah.
or whatever.
I
I
know. Who
mean,
wants to be in a chat room with them?
yeah, that's the thing. Yeah, I mean, yeah, and also like I mean another thing about free speech I guess is like if you run a publication, obviously you're not letting anyone submit. Like there needs to be some kind of standards there, and how
Yeah,
and also like, and like you could say you don't have ideological standards or something, but you would have standards about like the clarity of the argument and the logic of the argument or something. But then some particular arguments wouldn't be logical or clear or whatever. So would you then be like censoring that argument? I
yeah,
mean,
yeah. Or
so
even in that amount of space.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, right, yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
And
hmm
yeah, all of these are challenges. And the answer that we're usually given is like, well, you can only know the limit by talking about it.
hmm
And you have to, like, to define the limit, you have to talk about it. And I
yeah,
think it's Mill who discusses this, where it's like, yeah, and you talk about it forever, right?
yeah.
Like
I mean,
you're never gonna find it correctly. You always have to allow these other voices in. And as soon as you agree on one thing that's okay, or like one place where the limit should be, someone's going to disagree. And then you're going to do it again. And it never ends.
yeah.
It
I mean, I
never
do sort
ends.
of. I like that idea where it's like, it's not a place that's ever really settled, but like, it's a constant sort of process of debating and so on. Like, and you never like, there's no end point necessarily, but you maybe refine your position over time and so on.
Yeah, well, it can change completely. And that's the paradox of tolerance, isn't it? Where if you allow intolerant views in, they
Yeah.
eventually
Well, yeah.
dominate it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's,
And then they lock it
yeah.
out completely.
Yeah. But I suppose, I mean, we should probably wrap up soon and
Yeah,
not
yeah,
go on and
yeah,
on.
yeah.
But I think, I mean,
I think we've
the
had
thing,
this conversation before
yeah,
another
yeah,
day.
probably, yeah. The thing is like what counts as an intolerant view, and I feel like maybe nowadays more and more views are like sort of counted as intolerant and therefore like unspeakable or whatever, and then like justified to sort of,
I know. Tell that
uh,
to the divest people, boycott, divest, and sanction people. They know all about it.
oh right. I mean,
Yeah,
yeah. I mean, I
not
mean, I feel
limited
like
at all.
yeah. I mean, I think it could happen to left people on the left and right. I guess the thing is that people who's claim to stand up for free speech like would only apply it when for their own group, and they're not willing to stand up for someone they disagree with who's being censored or whatever in some way. Yeah.
Yeah, I
hmm
mean, there are all sorts of issues that you have to be aware of when you get involved with this. Bad faith arguments, right? That's a huge
Yeah.
problem. People who are just
hmm
trolling,
Yeah.
dog whistles, right? People who,
Yes. Right. Right.
they're communicating by,
hmm
kind of in secret.
Yeah.
But some publication like the Freethinker, with all that history behind it, especially predicated on so many other wonderful things like blasphemy,
Yeah. Yeah.
like
Yeah.
it's a wonderful project. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. I think it. Yeah. I mean, I definitely. We wish her success and
Yeah,
wish the
yeah,
magazine
and
success. I mean,
I'm pretty sure
yeah.
she's up to the challenge. She
Yeah.
can hold her own. She knows how to
Yeah.
talk.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm looking forward to it, and I think it'll have an important presence in the landscape, hopefully. I mean, I think there is so much, like, there's definitely, I mean, valuable publications that are, clearly left wing or right. Well, I mean, from my perspective, maybe the right wing ones are not as valuable, but I mean, like, the fact that they come from an ideological place, I mean, there's still is a lot of like value in them, but I think there was something like, that is nonpartisan or whatever, not clearly, no clear ideology or whatever. I mean, I think is valuable, and yeah, I mean, interested to see how it goes. And so I encourage people to check out the
Gotta check it
the
out
magazine. Yeah.
and contribute. So yeah, I'm looking
Yep.
forward to it. I can't wait. It was a great talk
hmm
with Emma.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, big thanks to
Yeah.
Emma Park, for
Yeah.
joining us today.
Yep. Oh yeah, and yeah, we should say like we get into more of the free speech issues in the bonus content. So if yeah,
It
like we
gets
talk a little bit
juicy. It's
more
good.
about that in the bonus section for which is available exclusively for patrons who support us on Patreon. So yeah, so definitely encourage people to support us if you're interested in that and you're finding the podcast interesting and so on. And we want to thank our current patrons, Lars, Debbie, and the AHS Plus blog.
I think it's
So
plus, plus, plus blog.
yeah. So thanks to all you guys, and to the audience for listening.
today. And if you can't support us monetarily through Patreon, easiest thing to do is like and subscribe. That way you get alerts whenever a new one drops. And definitely thank you for listening. Stay awesome, everybody.